Good evening, welcome to tonight's Holtzbrinck lecture with our Holtzbrinck Fellow, Anne Finger. This fellowship is intended to promote German-American dialogue in the fields of journalism, non-fiction and fiction. I think you cover at least two of those three categories. And I should thank one of our fellows, Stefan von Holtzbrinck, who supports this fellowship, and also welcome three of our trustees who are here tonight, Christine Wallich, Cathy Martin, and Anthony Vidler. You're very welcome. It's my pleasure to introduce Anne Finger. She's based in Oakland, California, great state. A writer of fiction and creative nonfiction, has taught creative writing at Wayne State University and the University of Texas at Austin. She's also a disability scholar and activist. And she's written about her own disability in the memoir, a book that I just read with great pleasure and learnt a lot and felt a lot. It's quite a remarkable work, Elegy for a Disease, a personal and cultural history of polio, and I couldn't recommend it more highly. Her short story collection, Call Me Ahab, which imagines disability in the lives of various real and literary figures, such as Goliath, Vincent van Gogh, Helen Keller and Frida Kahlo won the Prairie Schooner Book Prize. And she's also the author of two novels, A Woman in Bed and Bone Truth. Now, if you'd like to hear more, please mark your calendars, because Anne will be reading from her work on Monday, May the 6th at the English Theater in Berlin in cooperation with Theater Tikwa. Here at the Academy, Anne's project is called An Atlas of Disability in Berlin. And it's going to be a collection of essays that explore all the ways disability is encoded in the city of Berlin, from abandoned hospitals to memorials for disabled victims of the Nazis. Tonight, Anne will be talking about how different types of disability have been applied in popular and historical writings about Nazism, and what they reveal about how disabilities are perceived and politicized in general, I guess, not just in that particular period. And after Anne's talk, we'll have a Q&A with Anne, which will be moderated by Kenny Fries. And Kenny made sure that I understood that even though the name is written F-R-I-E-S, this is not something you have with currywurst. Just so everyone remembers, it's Fries. But we're delighted to have you here, Kenny. Thank you so much for doing the moderation. But ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Anne Finger.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I'm so happy to be here. I'm very nervous, but I'm very happy, and grateful to everybody that makes this wonderful place happen. And I'm the Holtzbrinck Fellow, and kind of by coincidence, two of my early books were published by a publisher that's part of that group. And my translator for those books, Christina Frick-Gurka, is right over there behind Terry. And she gave me this button, this beautiful button. So,
I also bought your books.
Oh, great. Thank you. Okay. Way to go. Thank you, Christina. So, as Terry said, my project here at the Academy is kind of mapping disability onto the geography of Berlin, thinking about ways that disability shows up in the city. And I'm interested in both historical events as well as literature and art. And I was inspired to begin this project when, on previous visits to the city, when I saw the Stolpersteine, the stumbling blocks, which mark the residences of those who were murdered by the Nazis. Many of those were Jews who were deported and killed, but there are also markers for those who were victims of the Nazi euthanasia program. Those with disabilities who were seen as being a threat to the hereditary health of the German people. So I really started to wonder about how other ways that disability could be kind of encoded in the city, the same way that the stumbling blocks are kind of encoded in various little locales of the city. And as a disability activist, I'm drawn, of course, to heroic disabled people and disabled people who are martyrs. And unfortunately, we don't all fall into those categories. So one of the people who I started thinking about was Joseph Goebbels, who was the Nazi minister of propaganda, as I'm sure almost all of you know, and had a deformed foot. And So in this talk, I'm going to explore the way not just that Goebbels' disability functioned in post-war American understandings of Nazism, but also of how, in general, the portrayal of Nazi leaders as being impaired, whether physically or psychologically, has served to make Nazism a sickness and deflected attentions away from the links between U.S. eugenics and racist thinking and Nazi ideology. There's a very important disability studies historian named Douglas Baton, who has this quote that gets quoted everywhere. Disability is everywhere in history once you begin looking for it, but conspicuously absent in the histories we write. And Doug kind of wishes he'd never said this because it gets quoted all the time, and he feels like, I'll never say anything else that intelligent ever again. There may be an exception that proves the rule about disability being conspicuously absent. And I would say that is in the treatment of Joseph Goebbels' club foot, which rather than being conspicuously absent seems almost conspicuously present. And what this slide shows, this is kind of a collage of different things that I pulled off out of various texts that talk about his club foot, his deformed foot, his, I guess, Klumpfuss is the word in German. So before I go any further, I should say this is an instance where the facts don't matter, or at least they don't matter much. It's incontrovertible that Joseph Goebbels walked with a limp and had a foot that could be described as misshapen. Sometimes it's his right foot, sometimes his left. It seems to have actually been his right, but it is often assumed to be his left, the left seeming more fitting given its connotation of the sinister, its connection to evil. Sometimes the cause is said to be polio, sometimes a botched operation following polio, sometimes osteomyelitis, sometimes a congenital defect. Goebbels himself claimed that it was due to an accident, a disability caused by an accident being preferable to one caused by an illness, although an illness is, of course, still preferable to the congenital. At least once Goebbels hinted that it was a wound resulting from World War I, a war wound being the most acceptable way of becoming disabled, although he soon stopped suggesting this, as it was too far from the facts. And yet, while the facts about his disability seem to matter very little, the fact of his disability seems to matter a great deal. It is so ubiquitous, cropping up even in very brief biographies. At one point, I sent an email to Kenny and said, I think that if there were a 25-word or less biography of him, it would say, Joseph Goebbels, Nazi Minister of Propaganda, had a club foot. I never found a 25-word or less biography of Goebbels, but I did find a 42-word one in Der Spiegel, which mentioned his club foot. In fact, while I have by no means done an exhaustive search, the one short bio I have found, which doesn't mention his club foot, is in the appendix to Philip Roth's novel, The Plot Against America, in which Roth imagines that Charles Lindbergh defeated Roosevelt in 1940, ushering in an anti-Semitic government that formed a rapprochement with Germany. It seems significant that a novel which is centered on Jewish life and anti-Semitism doesn't feel the need to highlight Goebbels' impairment. So I was particularly struck by these two lines from the biographical entry about him in Encyclopedia Britannica. He was exempted from military service during World War I because of his club foot, presumably a result of having contracted polio as a child, which later enabled his enemies to draw a parallel with the cloven hoof and limp of the devil. This defect played a disastrous role in his life by engendering in Goebbels a strong desire to be compensated for his misfortune. I quoted that in my earlier email to Kenny and then signed off with, how is your cloven foot and devilish limp? The Britannica entry floats two common tropes, one which allies disability with while at the same time attributing the notion not to the author of the encyclopedia entry, but to Goebbels' enemies. And physical disability as engendering psychological trauma, particularly a desire for vengeance. See works of art from Moby Dick at one end of the scale, and on the other end, any one of hundreds of horror movies in which the killer is facially disfigured, limps, has a hunchback. The disabled are seen as being deformed, crippled, bent, twisted, mutilated, defective, lame, broken, sick, mangled. I'm also interested with its air not just of violence. The foot has literally become a weapon, a cudgel, a bat, a bludgeon, but with a pre-modern feel to it, gesturing towards the presumption that Nazism could only be seen as an atavistic regression to a pre-modern world of brutality. And this slide just makes me think of the word clubfoot somehow. It's from a Bruegel painting of cripples making their way along. And then I actually really love this painting. It's called The Boy with the Clubfoot. And actually his clubfoot disappeared a little bit down here. I didn't quite get this lined up right. But he's a beggar, and he has a sign in his hand that says alms for pity, for pity's sake. But I love the expression on his face. But it does kind of have that association of what a clubfoot is like. And then, of course, there's this kind of medical drawing. I'm also really struck by the fact that a movement which had at its core notions of physical superiority and contempt for those seen as weak had as one of its most prominent members a man with a deformed foot. Indeed, few of the Nazi leaders matched the idealized body. Rather than being tall, blonde, muscled, they were generally short, dark, and inevitably aging men. As we're all aging. I can't help but wonder if knowledge of Goebbels' imperfection was in some ways a relief valve for the population's anxiety about how far they as individuals departed from the ideal. In July of 1937, an exhibition of degenerate art was held. And this is a poster of people outside it. It was set up by the Nazi government, and it was showing modern art as being degenerate. And of course, the word degenerate is very much connected to ideas about eugenics and disability. There's a recent film, I don't know if people have had a chance to see it yet. In English, it's called Never Look Away. And it's based on the life of Gerhard Richter, loosely based on the life of Gerhard Richter. And one of the scenes in it is when Richter is a very young boy, or the main character is a very young boy, goes to see this degenerate art exhibit. And paired with the degenerate art exhibit was an exhibit called the Great German Art Exhibit. And this is the kind of art that was shown there. This is called Comradeship. And there's no homoerotic subtext here. There's the degenerate art exhibit was kind of re-exhibited in the early, I think it was 1990s, in the U.S. And there was a catalog that accompanied it. And one of the essays in the catalog was by a man named Peter Gunther, who, as a young man in Germany, he was the son of an art critic, and his stepmother was Jewish. And he went to both the degenerate art exhibit as well as to this Great German Art Exhibit. And he describes being at the exhibit and walking around, and everyone is saying, "Oh, these are so realistic." And he said, "But nobody in the gallery looked anything like this." So I'm kind of struck with how the open secret of Goebbels' disability was a way of resolving the tension between the ideals of perfection and the reality of all the bodies that are in flux, that pregnant bodies, aging bodies, wounded bodies, dying bodies, the ordinary bodies that go through all the things that ordinary bodies go through, and how much that open secret of Goebbels' disability was sort of a way of resolving that tension between the ideal and the real that people lived. And Goebbels certainly wasn't the only Nazi leader who was seen as being damaged and warped. On the 10th of May, 1941, 20 months into World War II, in the midst of the Blitz, the solo pilot of a Messerschmitt abandoned his plane and parachuted into southern Scotland. The pilot turned out to be Rudolf Hess, Reich minister without portfolio, and close personal friend of Hitler. Apparently, Hess hoped not just to conclude a separate peace with Britain, but also to forge a military alliance between Germany and Britain, that the two nations might together battle the Bolshevik menace. Hess found himself taken prisoner. He thought he was going to be taken to London and get to meet the king, but that didn't happen. And it was held in various makeshift prisons, a Victorian mansion, and then later the Tower of London. During the 4 years he was held prisoner in Britain, Hess saw very few people other than military interrogators, low-level government officials, and psychiatrists, no less than 8 in the latter category. And this is a book that was written by those 8 British and American psychiatrists who examined him. And there's a lot in this book that I find fascinating. One description of him, in line with reading the essence of a human being from their physical appearance and finding animal characteristics in those who are seen as lesser, which is a notion that's deeply intertwined with eugenic thinking. Hess was described in this volume as having the appearance of being a caged great ape. And observers went on to enumerate his simian characteristics, from his receding forehead to his thick, bushy eyebrows, deeply sunken eyes, weak chin, and receding lower jaw. And Goebbels underwent a similar cataloging of his physical differences, with biographers seeming to delight in enumerating his flaws. He was not just ugly, but weasel-faced, stunted, narrow-shouldered, dwarfed. Hess collected various psychiatric labels. At points in this volume, he is described as being a typical schizophrenic, having hysterical amnesia, having delusions of persecution, psychotic symptoms, paranoid schizophrenia. He was also described as being sulky and cranky. And evidence of his maladjustment was given by the fact that when he was taken prisoner in Scotland, his pockets were stuffed with homeopathic remedies, including an elixir brought from a Tibetan lamasery by a Swedish explorer. And Hess certainly wasn't the only Nazi leader who was put on the couch. Prior to the Nuremberg war crimes trials, the defendants were all seen by psychiatrists, some of whom explicitly saw it as their mission not just to understand their individual patients and whether they were fit to stand trial, but also to, quote, study them as a researcher in a laboratory. Another quote, if Nazism was an illness that could infect people anywhere, even growing to epidemic proportions around the world, then the men visited in their Nuremberg cells represented isolated concentrates of the disease that could yield a protective inoculation. What I'm interested in here is the way it's seeing Nazism as a random sickness, the result of disease, of misbegotten individuals, is to turn away from the roots that gave birth to Nazi ideology. In particular, when it is deployed in a U.S. context, it deflects attention from the very real ideological links between American racism and ableism and Nazi Germany. And obviously, I don't have room in this talk to detail the history we all know too well of American racism and the genocide of the original peoples of the Americas. But I would like to talk about the links between anti-Semitism and eugenics in the U.S. and Nazi Germany. The links which are faced when we see Nazism as arising from pathology, whether physical or psychological. When I was first writing this piece, I was going to highlight the story that I had always heard growing up from my mother. My mom was a student at Radcliffe during World War II, and one of her classmates was Jewish. And when her classmates' parents, who were observant, visited her on the weekend, they could not find a hotel in Cambridge that would admit them. They were able to rent a hotel in Boston, but since they didn't drive or take public transportation on the Sabbath, they walked from Boston to Cambridge to visit their daughter. I thought that was the most shocking story I knew. It was the most kind of shocking story I knew. And I'm ashamed to say that I didn't have a sense of how deep and virulent anti-Semitism was in the U.S. at that period. It went far beyond refusals to rent hotel rooms, exclusions from clubs, the need that many Jews felt to change their surnames to ones that sounded more American. There was such virulent anti-Semitism, and there was no coded language, no rootless cosmopolitans, no international financiers, no dog whistles. Henry Ford was one American mentioned by name in Hitler's Mein Kampf, where he was saluted as a great man who stood up to the Jews. Ford purchased a newspaper called the Dearborn Independent, which in the 1920s published 91 anti-Semitic articles, many based on the notorious forgery, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which railed against the international Jew. Jews didn't only show up in the expected places, not just as international capitalists and international communists, but readers were also told that Jewish gamblers corrupt American baseball, and Jewish jazz becomes our national music. A few quotes from this latter article give a sense of the newspaper's viciousness, and also how anti-Semitism and anti-black racism were intertwined. Jazz is filled with monkey talk, jungle squeals, grunts and squeaks and gasps suggestive of cave love. The Dearborn Independent was really widely distributed through Ford dealerships. So you could head down to your local Ford dealer and order a Model T, as I used to say, in any color you wanted, so long as it is black, and get an anti-Semitic screed from your salesperson. In the mid-1920s, Ford was considering a run for the U.S. presidency, which caused jubilation on Hitler's part, who told a reporter for the Chicago Tribune, "I wish I could send some of my shock troops to Chicago and other big American cities to help in the election. We look to Heinrich Ford as the leader of the growing fascist movement in America. We have just had his anti-Jewish articles translated and published," and added that millions of copies of it were being distributed in Germany. In 1938, Ford was awarded and accepted the Grand Cross of the German Eagle. In 1933 in Germany, a law was passed calling for the sterilization of those who were seen as being hereditarily unfit. This law was directly based on model legislation developed by the U.S. eugenics movement, legislation which had been implemented in many U.S. states, including my home state of California, where as many as 20,000 disabled people had been forcibly sterilized. In fact, German leaders often pointed to the U.S. as an example and even saw their law as being more moderate than those in the U.S., given that there were said to be protections against misuse because of the hereditary health courts, which had to approve sterilization. Reference was also made to U.S. immigration policies, which favored Nordic countries. In 1935, a U.S. representative from the American Committee on Maternal Health visited Nazi Germany and was told, "The leaders in the German sterilization movement state repeatedly that their legislation was formulated only after careful study of the California experiment, and that it would have been impossible to carry out without the U.S. experience to draw on." So the people who were sterilized under this law were people with developmental disabilities, people with epilepsy, people with Huntington's chorea, a whole raft, people with blindness, a whole raft of different disabilities. Harry Laughlin, one of the most prominent U.S. eugenicists, received an honorary doctorate from the University of Heidelberg in 1936. The notion that certain people were biologically inferior and others biologically superior was, of course, at the core of Nazi ideology. As Rudolf Hess put it, National Socialism is nothing but applied biology. The film that I mentioned earlier, Never Look Away in English, tells of the central character's aunt being euthanized in the gas chambers that were first built, not in the concentration camps, but in the basement of killing centers, to which institutionalized people, those seen as being unable to work and therefore being useless eaters, were transported. American psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton began his exploration of German medicine in the Nazi doctors with his curiosity about the fact that it was medical men who met the trains at Auschwitz and decided who would be sent to the gas chambers. Not only did eugenic thinking, this idea of separating out those who could work and were allowed to live and those who were seen as unable to work and were sent to the gas chambers, not only did that form a direct link with the practices in the camps, but the connections were material, with gas chambers moved from the basements of killing centers to the camps. So my overall point, though, is that when Nazism is seen as pathology, as the result of warped individuals, the links between it and U.S. eugenic and racist practices are occluded. And what isn't examined can fester. The notion that in the U.S., eugenics and forced sterilization was universally rejected in the post-war era is widespread but untrue. Institutions still often required sterilization as a condition of release. Involuntary sterilization was also practiced without specific legal sanction. The great civil rights leader, Fannie Lou Hamer, who is probably not well known outside of a rather small circle of people who were really interested in the civil rights movement, but who was an amazingly courageous woman, a sharecropper, leader of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, was sterilized without her consent in 1961. The procedure was so common that it was called a Mississippi appendectomy. Hammer later testified that 60% of the black women in Sunflower County, Mississippi, were subjected to postpartum sterilizations at the city hospital without their permission. Returning to Berlin and to Goebbels, on one of my first days here, I went with some others from the Academy to visit the Holocaust Memorial, built near the bunker where Goebbels and his wife, as the Red Army advanced on Berlin, murdered their 6 children before themselves committing suicide. Jared, one of the other fellows, pushed my wheelchair, and as we went into the memorial, I felt the stone slabs looming ever larger above me. I had the sense of how small actions could devolve into larger actions until one was trapped. It is to the great credit of Berlin that this painful past is memorialized here. This stands in sharp contrast to the U.S. Oh, and this is the Holocaust, the euthanasia memorial that's been built here in Berlin. This is in stark contrast to the U.S., where only a few states have placed historical markers. I don't think that California has one, which only begin to reckon with our shared past of eugenics. So these are the kind of, these signs are very small. There may be, I don't know, like 3 by 4 feet or something. And you often have these kind of historical markers, you know, to show where a Civil War battle was fought or something was invented. But they're not the kind of, they're not memorials that call much attention to themselves. So this is one in Indiana that talks about sterilization in Indiana. But other than this, and there's a sign in Virginia, there's almost nothing else that recalls the eugenics movement in terms of a historical memorial. Certainly, as our nation continues to grapple with how we remember enslavement, genocide of Native peoples, or perhaps more accurately, fail to remember these, we must confront many other hard truths which deserve to be memorialized. Thank you.
Hi, Anne.
Hi, Ken.
I told him this would fall eventually. It did. I just want to start by just saying what a thrill and honor it is to be here with Anne, because we've known each other for decades. We can't figure out exactly when. We know when we met physically, but we met before physically. And this is the first time we're sharing a stage in in 22 years. The last time was in 1997 in Las Vegas, of all places, at a conference of the Association of Higher Education and Disability. And before that, when we actually met, was 1994, physically met, at the Contemporary Chautauqua on Disability and Performance at the Mark Taper Forum in Los Angeles. So I find this a very kind of historic thing, and that we came here in Berlin, I think, is just really interesting. So what I'd like to start to do is to put the work you're now doing in the context of your larger writing career. Because you've written both fiction, most recently the novel A Woman in Bed, and nonfiction, most recently the memoir An Elegy for a Disease. And much of your fiction, especially the stories in Call Me Ahab, is rooted in disability history. So I want to talk a little bit of how do you know what material will be fiction and what will be nonfiction, and when in the process do you know that?
I think I know fairly early on. I mean, I think once something is kind of conceptualized in my mind, it's either going to be a work of fiction or a work of nonfiction. Just because those things kind of seem to be born together. The idea and the form seem to be born together.
Because I was struck in your talk tonight when you said the facts don't matter. Mm-hmm. And I think that goes through a lot of the things you said, and also in what's going on, especially in the United States today, where facts don't seem to matter. And then you use, it's interesting because you use the word, and I guess people call the protocols of the elders of Zion a forgery, but it's really not a forgery. It's really just a lie.
Yeah, and it's also based on a work of fiction. It's based on, I don't know how much people know about the history of this, but it was published in the late 19th century by Tsarist secret police, if I got this right.
Like that, yeah.
But it was also based on an anti-Semitic novel that was published in the middle of the 19th century. I mean, it's a forgery in that it purports to be, yeah, forgery may not be the right word.
Yeah, but what's interesting to me is because so much of what happened in Action T4 can also be looked at as lies. People that were condemned to death, not because they were really disabled or because they were seen as disabled, whether it's because class distinctions, gender distinctions. So running through all this is this whole idea of what is a fact, what's fiction, which was interesting because of your work also plays with that notion. So that's why I started to think about that, and also. And then here, both of us are, Americans, United States writers, taking on a German subject, and maybe what could be called the German subject, Nazism. What do you find as the pitfalls, the challenges that come up with doing that?
I think the biggest pitfall is my lack of ability to speak German. Despite my, I'm making an effort to learn it, but it's slow. I'm most of what I'm doing Duolingo on the computer, so I can say all kinds of things like, Anna and Lucas are eating noodles. And then I'm trying to, Anna and Lucas are da-da-da-da. And then I'm trying to get on the train and talk to the conductor and let them know what I need, and I sure don't have the German for that. So, I mean, that's one big pitfall, is always having to be at a distance. On the other hand, I always think every pitfall is also an opportunity, that you're seeing something from the outside, that you are, in some sense, unfamiliar with it, that can really give you a fresh perspective. And it's a little bit like, do fish know they're in water? They may or they may not, but that what constantly surrounds you can be hard to see. Whereas when you get taken out of your everyday world, where you always are, where everything's familiar, things can have a much you can see things from a different angle.
This kind of segues around this what you just said, because you pointed out in your presentation that you showed the T4 memorial outside the Philharmonie, which is where the villa of Tiergartenstrasse 4, which is where T4 comes from, the bureaucratic headquarters for Action T4 was, and then you showed the eugenics sign in Indiana, but it took until 2014 for the T4 memorial to be built in Berlin, whereas the other memorials, it's pretty much the last memorial. What does that say to you about about how Germany remembers or doesn't remember T4 and what happened to disabled people during those years?
I'm always struck by how, certainly in the U.S., how little knowledge there is of the quote-unquote euthanasia program, of the killing of German disabled people. And I think a lot of that stems from a feeling that maybe sterilization of some people isn't so bad, that maybe some people's lives really are not worth as much as other people's lives, that those ideas are still embedded in us as a culture, and they're very hard to root out, because I feel like they are so just so deeply embedded in our way of thinking. And I'm also fascinated. I mean, one thing that the eugenics movement really thought a lot about was about being able to read from a face what somebody's essence was like, and that there were people who just showed their degeneracy and their inferiority on their faces. And I do think there's this kind of half-life of discredited ideas that we carry around with us. So I don't know if people here are familiar with, I guess it was about 10 years ago, there were two serial killers in Washington, D.C., who were snipers, who were preying on people. And one of them was John Malvo. And I remember looking at his face and saying, I can't believe this. He looks like an angel. And I think I still have some of those ideas about, about what people are going to, some of those eugenic ideologies, I think, embedded in all of us. And I think it's hard to disentangle.
Well, it's also interesting, I just thought of this, is that in your talk, you talked about the sterilization both of people that were deemed disabled and also of African Americans. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because, again, the racial gets mixed up with the disability, mm-hmm. Which is kind of and that's the same thing that happened here. And it's eugenics, so right. It's because eugenics is really is some of it is racially based and some is not racially mm-hmm. based. So it's interesting how that just is something also that's tangled together that can't really be intertwined. How has you been here now since January? So it's been a few months, yeah. Has being here physically, being here, and you mentioned, I know you've been searching the Stolperstein all over the place, and how has that affected your thinking about what you're writing? Has it affected it at all, or?
I feel like I'm still in the really early stages of this book, so I'm kind of like still sort of feeling my way around, and I'm very much. I don't want to get too much of a fixed idea about what I'm going to do. It was really interesting with Tony and with Andy. We did a podcast and we went out to a former mental asylum on the edge of the city, and I had seen pictures on the internet of this abandoned asylum and these hallways that were sort of covered with mold and all this rust and this abandoned equipment. And we got out there and we discovered it had been gentrified, made over into housing. So I kind of want to be open to those sort of unexpected contrasts to kind of see what happens.
Yeah, having been here now for 5 years, I still find those things. I mean, it kind of started with, oh my God, people live where Hitler's bunker was. I mean, how do they feel about it? To things like we went to Pasternak, where we showed you there's a water tower that's made into apartments across the street, and there used to be a torture place for the Gestapo or the police. So there's always that kind of unbalancing to me. That's the way I feel about what one finds, and it's not like when you go to Mexico and you see the cathedral built upon the indigenous temple. It's things that happened within the last 100 years or so. So it's just endlessly fascinating to me. When the artist Quintin Anna Wixwo was when she had her show at the Jewish Museum of photos of the what she calls the rape brothel at Dachau. We had an evening in my apartment for her to share her work around disability stuff, because that wasn't in the show. And she started, I was at the very beginning of my work on the subject, and she said, you really have to be careful, because she landed up getting very depressed and having nightmares and stuff like that. How does dealing with this material, has it affected you at all? Do you sense it in any way?
I do have to be careful with what I work on at night. I mean, I do kind of have this ability to sort of like, okay, I'm thinking about this really intensely now, and now I'm going to stop thinking about it. And I'm not going to think about it after 6 o'clock, because I'll have nightmares.
Interesting thing. How are we doing on time? We're fine? Okay. 40 minutes. Oh my God, we can talk forever.
They might have some questions at some point.
I know. Yeah. Should we open it up to see what people? I'd say we could always come, and I could talk to Anne forever. So if anyone has questions while we have a nice pause, now we can start hearing you. Yeah.
Do we want to wait for the mic, or? Just also because we're taping this, so.
Oh, okay. So my name is Kati Martin, and I'm a trustee here, and I'm so pleased and proud to have you. And that was just a deeply moving presentation. Thank you, and wonderful to meet you as well, Ken. I'm just wondering, you spoke about the challenge of partly linguistic, but partly obviously other forms of challenge of maneuvering public transportation in Berlin. Could you make some comparisons between just sort of the routine life of a disabled person in Berlin versus in an American setting? What are the? I'm a New Yorker, and I sometimes observe people maneuvering in the New York subway, and it's no fun. But can you speak to how you find Berliners reacting, and are they different in their approach to you?
I would say a couple of things. First off, I live in the Bay Area, which is not representative of the U.S. It considers itself to be the birthplace of the disability rights movement, and also we do in the U.S. have, and especially in California, have some pretty strong civil rights laws, and so there's definitely a legal push that people feel that they have to make things accessible. New York can be very different. I'm a really intrepid traveler. I've traveled all over the world. I've taken the local buses in Guatemala, where my neighbor asked me to hold her chicken for her. But I don't brave the New York subways.
about the people? How about the reaction? Are people more or less helpful, friendly?
I find, and I think you have a different experience of this that maybe we could talk about. You know, in the U.S., well, I think especially in California, people are a lot sort of friendlier overall. And I almost always have this experience of people on the street smiling at me. And sometimes it gets to be very wearing. And I think about a story my dad used to tell. He was an officer who was stationed in San Francisco for part of the time during World War II. And when he would walk along Market Street in San Francisco, all the enlisted men had to salute him, and he had to salute back. And he would just be going down Market Street going... And he would talk about like finding alleys to run up so that he didn't have to keep saluting. And I sometimes feel that way in the version of I'm getting smiled at all the time. Everybody's saying hello to me. But I think that also is age and gender and being a wheelchair user, because you have a different experience, right?
Yeah, I have two experiences because I use my wheelchair and I don't use my wheelchair, so I always have those comparisons to make. Number one, I find Berlin to be very accessible. I lived in Toronto beforehand, which was extremely not accessible. There was we were talking about this over dinner. The transit system is much smaller for a city that's the same population as Berlin. There are only two lines, one northwest, and one north-south, and one east-west. That's it. And then there's streetcars, which when we lived there was not accessible. I think they were first buying their first accessible streetcars. When Anne, we talked about this in my apartment, and I said, people smile at you all the time? I don't get that in the States. Maybe because I'm not in Berkeley. I don't, or in California. But I do, now that I've lived in Germany for as long as I have, for 5 years, and I don't realize it as much as when I'm here. It's when I go away and I come back that I realize it. The difference of going into a restaurant and saying with the wheelchair, and there's always seems to be a moment where, oh, how are we going to deal with this? Whereas in Italy, oh, it's just another piece of the chaotic puzzle. It doesn't make a difference. Even in Shanghai, where we were going to restaurants which could fit at this table, they were so small. I was wondering, oh my God, how are we going to do this? You know, people that aren't wheelchair users can't fit in there. As soon as we went in, it was just dealt with in some way, you know. But we won't. I mean, also in Shanghai, Mike says my husband said we were sitting there waiting for a taxi, and a bus came along, and I was like in the zoo. Everybody in the bus was staring at me. But I don't realize until I get back to Germany how much of not a big deal, but how much the disability makes a difference. I feel much more invisible in the US as a disabled person as I do here. Well, that wonderful experience we had when you came to visit a few years ago, when we were both using the wheelchair on the train, and you started talking to them, and I said, I don't think they even know what you're saying, because I don't think they knew English. There were two wheelchair users, and it was as if the people did not ever see two wheelchair users at the same time. And you said out loud, like, look at them, they're looking at whatever. And I'm thinking they're probably not even understanding what you're saying. But I wouldn't get that sense in New York even. Uh-huh. And I don't know what to make of this, but it's just there. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that was, yeah. And I lived in Japan, which is a whole other story. So, yeah.
Anne, it's Prerna. I'm thrilled to be Anne's fellow. I had a question about, your disability atlas, which we are fortunate enough to kind of get regular updates from Anne at breakfast and dinner about her experiences. It's it's an atlas of how a disabled person is navigating buildings and a city, an architecture, a cityscape made by non-disabled people. And that, of course, was also the question to you earlier. And I realize that's the world that we live in, which is that you are constantly being asked to maneuver, to navigate, to comment on, and to map a world made by non-disabled people. And I was wondering if in any way there was, and I was talking about manifestos earlier, and so maybe this is on my mind a little, but I'm just wondering whether there's been a movement or a manifesto or some kind of a utopia even, in which there is, instead of trying to make an atlas for how a disabled person navigates a city made by non-disabled people, what would a city made from your point of view, or architecture, that was specifically for disabled people, that non-disabled people lived in? Like, have there been any movements? I have a 5-year-old. I often think of playgrounds. So, is there a kind of ideal? Do you think sometimes, collectively or individually, about what such scapes and architecture might look like?
Well, there is a movement for universal design. And the idea behind universal design is that things are built to be accessible to as many people as possible. So, for instance, I don't know if this company manufactures stuff here, but there's a company in the U.S. called OXO, O-X-O, that makes, can openers and all kinds of kitchen equipment. And it's actually not designed specifically for disabled people, but it's designed so that it's usable by people with all different kinds of impairments. But it doesn't advertise itself that way, and you buy it in a regular supermarket, on a regular supermarket shelf. I think the other thing that's part of that question, though, or part of the answer to that question is an experience that we very much had within the disability movement, which is that access is always a work in progress. We may have a space that's accessible to wheelchair users, but that is not kind of the end step of it. What does it mean to make spaces that are really accessible to blind people or to deaf people? Or, one of the problems we run into now at disability studies conferences is we have a sign language interpreter, and we have real-time transcription. So up on a screen, everything that's getting said is getting typed up on a screen, and then it's a hard situation for people with autism because it's just like too much stuff happening all at once. So, I do believe in design that takes into account everybody, and I also think we're never going to have a final hard and fast rule about what that is. Does that answer your question? Kenny, did you want to?
The thing I learned when I lived in Japan was something I used to talk about in the United States was always equating access to a building. If I said, think about a building that African Americans couldn't get into or women couldn't get into, and disabled people, and making that. When I went to Japan, that made no sense to them because it's a much more homogenous society. And there I figured out the key was the elderly, since it's one of the most elderly societies. So anything that was going to be designed for a disabled person would also help an elderly person. So I made that connection there.
I think one other thing I want to say in terms of access and design is a lot of things that are kind of designed originally for disabled people actually come to have a very wide applicability and usability. So, for instance, the typewriter was first invented so that a blind woman could write love letters to her lover. Closed captioning that gets used on TV now. Originally it was designed for people who were deaf, and now it gets used by English language learners a lot, or foreign language learners a lot. It also gets used by people who don't consider themselves to be deaf, but they can't quite hear what's going on all the time on the TV. Or it'll often be used when there's non-standard English being used as a way for people to have access to those shows. So, there's a lot of stuff that is originally designed for disability that really gets a much wider usage.
It reminded me that my students at School of Visual Arts, that did their master's program on rebranding disability, and they're the ones that brought up OXO. I think the wife of the team that designed it had a disability of some sort. And she had difficulty opening things, and that's where that came from. Yeah. Yes.
Actually,
What?
I'll pass the mic. I have it here. This is Emily, another fellow. And I had a question about the language of disability, which I assume is sort of a work also in progress, always changing. When I'm advising PhD theses these days, there's been quite a lot of interesting work on other abilities, on other capacities, including mental ones, other subjectivities or modes of cognition. But there's been a real uncertainty about what language to use for that. So I guess this is just it's in some ways a compliment to your question, but it's how you've thought over the years, because you've been part of a movement that's gone on for a very long time, about the language of abilities or other different abled subjectivities. I think it's a very interesting and complex question. And of course, for someone who works on literature, these stereotypes about the mental universes are constantly a problem, right? I mean, they're just as much as reading faces. They're mental physiognomies that are constantly being stigmatized. So, and I think it poses a problem for any teaching of literary work. So I just wondered if you had thoughts about your own work and in relation to this problematic language, this evolving vocabulary.
Do you want to say anything? You want me to? I like the word disabled, and I like the word disabled people, the words disabled people. For a while, there was a big push to, I like disabled just because it's kind of a word our community has chosen for itself. It is direct. For a long time, there was a push to have people first language, to say person with a disability. And I just don't like that because we don't say a person who is female. And also disability is a social experience as well as an impairment. So I think disabled person conveys that much better. Then when you get into questions about neurodiversity, and I always say if you're talking about a specific person, ask them what kind of language they want, and I think also ask them why they want that language, because I think often having that discussion about the different kind of weight that certain terminology has. There was one point where my friend Barbara Waxman and I published an article, and we talked about people who were severely euphemized. Because I hate all that language that's like...
differently able, physically challenged.
Physically challenged,
different,
Yeah.
It's interesting because I was never able to write until I realized that the words I used were disabled and non-disabled. Never will use the word able-bodied. It makes absolutely no sense to me, since nobody really is able-bodied. That was a really important thing. Siggy had a question here. Bring the mic.
Yes, thank you. Yes, my name is Sigrid. I'm the director of Independent Living Germany, and I've got a question concerning the comparison of the legislation in US and Germany. During the dinner, I talked to Terry and talked about a very new decision of our highest court, the Constitutional Court, and it's referring to the legislation on elections, the voting legislation. And the highest court said it's unlawful that 58,000 disabled people are not allowed to vote in Germany. And so the legislation must be changed. And I don't know how the legislation in the US is. Is everybody allowed to vote?
Can you
or not.
explain to me a little bit more about the 58,000 people who weren't allowed to vote?
Yeah. Pardon? Yeah, under guardianship, who are under guardianship in all cases, and the people who committed a crime and have a psychological disease and are imprisoned in a hospital afterwards. They are not allowed to vote. 85,000. And I don't know, is there a comparable legislation in the US, or is everybody allowed to vote? Because I think it's a rest of eugenic thinking in Germany.
I think in the situation in the U.S., the situation is a lot more complicated because voting is on a state-by-state basis. And certainly, I mean, there is enormous disenfranchisement in the U.S. having to do with people who've been convicted of felonies. And of course, that legislation, that deprivation of voting rights overwhelmingly affects African Americans. And I haven't seen studies about this, but I would imagine it also overwhelmingly affects people with disabilities, that they're more likely to find themselves incarcerated and convicted of felonies. So, but in terms of guardianship legislation, I don't think there's, as far as I know, there isn't any specific law about that.
Yeah, I think the problem in the U.S., I know the problem in Canada, is the fact that a lot of polling places are still not accessible, or the method of voting isn't accessible, the machines, et cetera, and so on. There has been, and I can't remember where I read it, there was some discussion of whether somebody who needed somebody to help them mark the ballot, because it's supposed to be a private ballot, whether that was legal or not. I don't know. I read something about it, but I don't know what came of that. Yeah.
But they are allowed to vote.
Yes. Yeah. Want to pass?
Yes. Hello, I'm Andy, and among many other things, I'm the great-grandson of a T4 victim. And I want to thank you, Anne, for your talk. And there are two things, or like, I mean, I had the impression that in a way you're comparing U.S. commemoration politics and German commemoration politics, and kind of looking up to German commemoration politics. And I just want to say that also in Germany, most Germans have no clue what T4 is. Really, no clue. And also what I want to say is that there's also a debate about that T4 commemoration site, because it's at the site where the perpetrators were. And that's a big problem, I think. So, and I mean, I could speak for a long time about German commemoration politics, but I don't want to do that now. But there are many problems. And yeah.
Yeah, I didn't mean to suggest that there were no problems, just that I think there is an acknowledgement here, at least on some level, in a way that there isn't in the U.S.
Yeah, well, in the U.S., people always say that, I know the phrase is, it can happen here. And a lot of it did happen there. The 1927 U.S. Supreme Court Buck v. Bell decision, written by Oliver Wendell Holmes, one of the lauded, liberal justices, with the famous, which basically said it was constitutional to forcibly sterilize disabled people, with the famous phrase, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. People don't know that there's a long history of that in the state, or in Canada, where I lived for many years. There, it's even more buried, the whole eugenics idea. So Rebecca had something here.
And then Martin.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Rebecca. I'm a research assistant, and I'm doing a PhD in disability studies. And I also wanted to go back to your topic of narrative of disability. And also somehow can relate to what Andy just said, that I think it's some things are really comparable between the US and in Germany. And I really had to think about, when you talked about Goebbels' clubfoot being sort of a symbol for evilness, I had to think about the portrayal of Hitler in a famous German film called Der Untergang, where it shows the last days of Hitler and his follow us in the bunker, and there a lot of times his Parkinson is shown, his Parkinson disease, and they show the sort of the twitching, is that right? Of his hand, and this is always kind of used as a narrative or as a sort of a visual trope of decay and his sort of being on the border to death and of course of his evilness, which I thought, yeah, well, it's just so I don't know, simplistic. And this is a German film that was very successful. So anyway, I was wondering, would you say that there's also that this narrative is changing in the US? Because a lot of times I think that the US is a bit further also in the portrayal of disability and a bit, more advanced than in Germany, I would say. So there are similarities, but still a lot of times I find that the US is just, in those cases, a bit more reflective than our culture.
I think it's such a mix. I think certainly for things like the history of eugenic sterilization, that gets very little attention in the US. Whereas I do think in terms of kind of broader awareness of contemporary disability rights, that there is a lot more awareness. And I think the fact that we have an ADA, that there's a really strong legal protection, I'm very aware of that as making a big difference. So I think it's an incredibly mixed heritage. And then Martin had his hand up back there.
Thank you, Martin, another fellow. We've been talking about this comparison, the US versus Germany, and it seems to me that there is actually a direct link. That is, the reason why there hasn't been a reckoning in the US of the incredibly strong eugenics movement is precisely because of the Nazis. Mm-hmm. Because the Nazis made it untenable in the US by and large. So we could, the US could look at Nazi Germany and say, all right, now we understand where this leads. We can't do this anymore, by and large. But the blame or the reason were the Nazis. It wasn't a kind of reckoning with US history. Mm-hmm. I don't know, that's just a kind of theory. Would you agree with that?
Oh, yeah, very much so. And I also think, the fact that eugenics didn't get admitted to meant that it kind of festered underground. So that we did have sterilization continuing. We just kind of pretended that we didn't. But it was still very much there. Until really the early 1970s. And even more recently than that, there's a law in California that says that people in prison basically can't be sterilized unless there's a medical reason for it. Precisely because it's a situation where people really can't give pre-consent when they're in prison. And there were 120 women sterilized in a California state prison recently, within the last decade. So it still happens. Yeah.
Hi, I'm going to stand up. Disabled moment. Hi, my name is Perel, and I'm an American, actually coming here from New York. So yeah, the subways are like a dimension of hell, like a Dante-esque nightmare. But I also have wondered about this comparison here, because I don't know, I've wondered about what the American ethos is of not being able to look back at history with the conscience. In the same, in comparison to here, except that here it seems like a lot of memorials have also been forced to happen as well, and I've wondered, maybe it's a question for the Germans in the room, about, if having a consciousness of what has happened changes your worldview versus in America the way it's like squelched in a way. But also I also wanted to bring up the very real situation right now in the States of children being placed in detention facilities who are trying to live there, who have been separated from their families who have come there, and how there's not any kind of real language around that happening, and how that can be happening even. So it's like this erasure of history that makes it so that that kind of thing can happen. And if we were to be able to memorialize the various forms of oppression that have happened there, would it change our worldview?
I mean, I like to think that really being able to memorialize and acknowledge things would make a difference. I mean, and I do think we see some of that in some of the struggles around Confederate memorials that are happening today. And, beyond Confederate memorials, there was just a statue that was, I believe it's now been taken down in San Francisco. It was right by the San Francisco Public Library, which was a Native American person down on their knees before a white settler. To get us rid of that comfortable illusion that these troublesome statues are just someplace else. They're off in the terrible South. I mean, they're in San Francisco too, and so I mean, I do think that an important part that move around certainly around Confederate memorials is a sense of how we remember is vitally important, and what we remember, how we memorialize things.
Unless we forget that in the United States, that during the same war, the Japanese Americans were interned. So, and that the whole history of remembering that, and that whole thing is also something that's not thought of a lot.
And even the word interned.
Yeah.
My friend Kenji, whose father was in a as Kenji says, he was in a Japanese American concentration camp.
Yeah,
it's a concentration camp.
Took the property, just went. They had.
Yeah.
See that you had a question.
Well, thank you so much for the wonderful presentation and for the very interesting discussion. I have a question in regards to the political climate in the U.S. and the upcoming elections. I just wonder in terms of...
I've got that same question.
All right. I just wonder, we are all aware about certain policies that make certain groups feel, let's say, at risk currently in the United States. And I just wonder, what is the feeling in the community of disabled people in terms of you feel Lina's inclination towards supporting any of the parties? You feel favored for any of the parties or disfavored by any of the parties? What would be your reflections on that?
I don't think I can speak for the whole disabled community, but...
Sure you can.
But I'm very happy to see the rise of a politics that is really talking about the common good. That the word socialism is no longer a dirty word in America, that you can actually say that word in polite company. And that there's a growing notion of we're part of a community, we're all part of a community together, which because I think American individualism has been so dangerous. And obviously, I hope the person who's in the White House doesn't stay there for much longer for many reasons.
Somebody back there has their hand up.
Hi, hello. Thank you for the talk. I thought in being as it's the American Academy, I thought for this to go by without mention of FDR would be remiss. And I just wondered if you could talk about how tropes of disability have maybe occurred in America with regards to FDR, as opposed to with regard to Goebbels and the Nazis?
Sure. You know, one of the things I'm most fascinated about with FDR was, you know, supposedly his disability was hidden. You know, once he resumed his political career, there were really no pictures taken of him.
One in his wheelchair, that's it.
One in his wheelchair, which he actually rarely used a wheelchair because there really weren't the kind of wheelchairs that we have nowadays. He was mostly carried around, often by his African-American servants. On the other hand, everybody knew he was disabled. I mean, when I was a kid growing up, I'd say to people, I had polio. And it was like, just like Roosevelt. I heard that so many times. I always had this feeling of like, I'm going to grow up to be president. It's just and on the other hand, I think Roosevelt was so canny. I mean, I think he was so good at sort of knowing what the stereotypes were about disability and working against them. So, for instance, when he first got nominated in 1932, one of the first things he did was get in a boat and go up the Hudson really fast with the press kind of trailing him and trying to keep up with him. And I think it was sort of this notion of like, I'm moving. I can go places. And I think even that things like the way that that his image became the hat and the cigar and the cigarette and the cigarette holder, you know, that image was really a way of deflecting away from his disability and saying, this is the image, this is who I am. And I also don't think he felt a lot of personal shame about disability. When he came back from the Yalta Conference, it was the start of his fourth term, and he knew he was not going to run again. And he kind of didn't have to do the charade anymore, because he used to do a thing of, he would have special podiums rigged up where he could stand with grips on them so that he could hold himself upright. When he came back from Yalta, he addressed a joint session of Congress sitting down. And he begins by saying, excuse me for addressing you from this unusual posture, but I have 12 pounds of steel on my legs, and I'm tired, and I'm going to sit down. And then the whole Congress applauds. And it's kind of like, I just had this feeling of people are kind of going, okay, we're finally saying it. It's finally out in the open. That's why they're applauding. So, I mean, I think FDR's legacy has been very mixed, because in some ways it was okay to be disabled as long as you like hid it from people.
And as long as you triumphed over it.
Triumphed over it, yeah.
Was it John Hockenberry that called him the champion self-loather? Or is it the guy who wrote FDR? There's a wonderful book called FDR's Splendid Deception that deals with all of this, of all the disability-related things with FDR, written by a disabled person, which I think in this case matters. He also theorized in the book that a lot of what happened at Yalta and towards the end of the war had a lot to do with his ill health and how that relates. I think it's problematic. I think if you go to Hyde Park, where he lived, it was very interesting that he had rigged up a system of getting from one floor to the next. He basically used the dumbwaiter that was transferring food to get thing, and also in a separate part of his house on the hill, and I can't remember the name of the hill. It was an amazingly accessible place. There was no lips from the door. It's where he had the Queen and the Queen of England. He served hot dogs to them. Yeah, And John Hockenberry has had the quote of his of saying that if FDR had developed advanced transferring techniques from his wheelchair, it's lost to us like Mayan shopping lists. And so there's a lot of loss of disability culture and the everyday life of a disabled person there as well. So I think it's very problematic. I just want to let you know that when I mentioned FDR in Japan, this was only in 2005. Nobody knew who he was.
If you said Roosevelt, did they know?
I don't know. I had to explain, he was the head of the, that was really interesting. So, I've had some people say to me he was disabled, even in the United States. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. Is that right? Yeah.
Okay, right in the corner there.
Hi, Jenny Ellen, another fellow. Thanks, Anne, for this talk. It's always a delight to hear you talk about this project. So I'd like to take you back to memory politics, and I want to ask two questions that in some ways push you beyond the scope of this project, but I think you're in an interesting place to reflect on them. And the first is basically, you mentioned that the T4 memorial was sort of late in coming, but reflecting on Germany's actually remarkably creative memory landscape, do you think that the U.S., given its own struggles to acknowledge its history of euthanasia, is there something that the U.S. can learn from German memory politics? And the second question is, who do you think is in a position in the U.S. to lead that initiative? And I asked both of those questions. You started by talking about the Stolpersteine, that's a sort of pet project of my own, which I think are a particularly interesting memorial project that takes memory outside of its kind of conventional locations. And is there something like that could be brought to the States to commemorate euthanasia? And then my second question on agency is, although the T4 Memorial was late and is a sort of top-down project that began actually much earlier in the 1980s as a grassroots initiative. A bunch of amateur historians and community members got together and said, we need some kind of memorial to euthanasia. And so I'm just curious, is there something that German memory politics can offer to the U.S., and who should bring that to us?
The one thing I think of is there have been some moves to compensate people who were victims of forced sterilization, particularly in Virginia. And there was a whole procedure set up for people to be compensated, and then the legislature ran out of money, and it never happened. But I think that kind of, I'm always a believer in grassroots, and I'm always a believer in action initiated by people who've been directly affected by it. And there are still I don't know about quite a few, but there are still some survivors of involuntary sterilization. And I've seen a couple of very moving interviews with people who talk about the impact that this has had on their life. And I think those kind of memorials might be an interesting place to start.
What is that?
I think your translator wanted to say something.
Oh, yeah. Can we have the mic? Over here behind Cherry.
No, it just struck me that your two early books I translated about 20 years ago, they ran in the Women in Society series at Fisher Publishers. And it just struck me, did it ever make a difference to be female and disabled? Or would you say it has changed? Or would you say it was never really important?
I think it's a big question, and yeah, I think being female and disabled is a big area. I mean, one thing, just to answer really quickly, one thing I always felt as a girl growing up disabled was that, I grew up in the 1950s and 1960s, and there really wasn't always an assumption that I was going to accomplish something. You know, there was never this thing of, you're going to be a wife and mother. In fact, it was, you're not going to be a wife and mother, but you will have a career. You'll do important things. So that's one really quick answer to a very complicated question. That if you want to talk to us later, we've got a lot to say.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.